The smoke burns my throat as I drag the body toward the fire pit. Blood pools beneath the rushes, dark and steaming, and the slaves wait in silence, their eyes lowered. Ragnar walks among them, barefoot in the ash, his voice calm, almost gentle. That's when they fear him most. He does not shout, he teaches. One slave he frees, another he flogs, and no one can ever tell which lesson he is teaching until it's too late. I've seen him break a man's will with kindness and crown another with chains. To Ragnar, obedience was not born, it was forged, and those who served him learned that pain and favour could come from the same hand. This is Viking life, merciless, unflinching, and absolute. Stay with me and witness the truth behind the slaves. The smoke hangs thick inside the longhouse, curling through the rafters like a spirit that cannot find its way to the afterlife. My throat burns as I breathe it in, and the taste of it, oak, sweat, and blood, clings to my tongue like guilt. The fire pit glows low, the last embers reflecting off the iron chains nailed into the wall. They rattle softly with every gust of wind that slips through the cracks. That is the only sound that dares to speak when Ragnar Lothbrok walks through the hall. He moves like a storm wrapped in calm. His cloak drags across the straw, wet from the snow outside, his eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his brow. The slaves bow their heads as he passes. None look up, not even the bravest. For in this hall silence is the first law, the second is obedience, and the third, never forget who owns your breath. There is a man kneeling near the fire, his back bare, shoulders shaking. His mistake was small, a spilled cup of ale, perhaps, but Ragnar believes in lessons carved deep enough to be remembered in the next life. He does not strike first, he speaks. His voice is low, patient, almost kind. He tells the man that the world is built on order, that chaos begins with carelessness. Then he gestures to one of his warriors. The whip cracks. Once, twice. The man does not scream. Not yet. Ragnar watches, his hands clasped behind his back. There is no pleasure in his eyes, only calculation. To him, pain is a tool, as necessary as a plough or a sword. The others watch from the corners of their vision, learning in silence. In this house, mercy is not given, it is measured. When the punishment ends, Ragnar kneels beside the broken man and lifts his chin. You will heal, he says softly, and when you do, you will remember this fire. Then, to the astonishment of all, he orders the man to be fed and given furs for the night. The whip was his judgment, the warmth is his forgiveness. That is how he keeps them loyal, through fear laced with unexpected grace. As the night deepens, the hall settles back into uneasy quiet. Outside, the snow keeps falling, burying the footprints of the living and the dead alike. The slaves lie beside the walls, half dreaming, half listening for the sound of his boots. None sleep fully, none dare. For in Ragnar's world, the boundary between master and slave is drawn not in ink or law, but in blood, and the fire never stops reminding them of it. The smoke burns again as I breathe, and I realize something terrible. Even silence has learned to obey him. This is how power lives in the longhouse of smoke and silence. Morning comes slow to Ragnar's hall. The frost clings to the beams, the smoke from last night's fire still twisting in lazy ghosts above the dying embers. The slaves rise before the Sunday. Their hands are raw, their backs bent. Every movement is a prayer that today will not draw his gaze. But Ragnar Lothbrok sees everything. He sits at the high seat with a bowl of goat's milk and a piece of black bread, eyes fixed on the man who carries his axe for sharpening. The man's hands tremble, the blade slips, grazing Ragnar's thumb. A single drop of blood falls into the milk. The hall freezes, no one breathes. Ragnar lifts his hand slowly and looks at the red smear against his skin. A man must know the weight of what he holds, he says quietly. His voice does not rise. It cuts deeper for that reason. The The trembling slave drops to his knees, pressing his forehead to the dirt. Ragnar rises. His footsteps are soft, measured, the way a wolf circles prey that has already surrendered. He does not strike him, not yet. Instead, he takes the whip from the wall and lays it across the table. "Tell me," he says, "why should I not return this mistake upon your back?" The slave lifts his head, eyes wet, and answers in a whisper, "Because I meant no harm, my lord." Ragnar's mouth curves into something almost like a smile. No harm, meaning is for the gods. Men are judged by their deeds. He turns to his warriors and adds, "But words can bind tighter than chains." He orders the man to stand and face him. Then he commands him to repeat an oath. "I will serve as if my hands were his own, my breath his will." Each word is a thread pulled tight around his throat. Ragnar listens, nods, and when the last word leaves the man's lips, he tosses the whip back onto the table. "No lashes today," he says. "Only the weight of your promise." The hall exhales as one. The slave weeps not from mercy, but from the terror of knowing he now belongs to Ragnar in voice as well as body. Later, when the sun climbs above the thatch, Ragnar walks outside. The snow creaks beneath his boots. He looks toward the fjord where his ships rest, black and patient as ravens. A slave girl trails behind him, carrying his fur cloak. He does not look back, but he says, "If they obey from fear alone, they will serve until the first storm. But if they obey from the word, they will die, still calling my name." She nods, though she knows better than to speak. He steps into the wind, and the sound of the sea swallows his words. Inside the hall, the whip lies untouched, but every man feels its echo across his soul. The day begins with the clang of iron. Ragnar's slaves file into the yard, each carrying a pail of frozen water from the well. The frost bites their fingers raw, and the wind cuts through their wool rags like knives. Above them, Ragnar stands on the steps of the longhouse, watching in silence. He says nothing for a long while. That silence is heavier than any order. When he finally speaks, it is not to command, but to ask, "What is freedom worth if it makes a man weak?" His voice drifts through the cold like smoke. None dare answer. Ragnar gestures to one of the men, a tall thrall named Eldar, who once fought against him in Northumbria before the chains. Eldar steps forward, jaw clenched. Ragnar points to a boulder near the fence, half buried in snow. "Lift it," he says. Eldar tries. He strains until his breath steams like fire, but the stone does not move. Ragnar watches, face unreadable. "You were a free man once," he says. "You fought well, you lost. Tell me, does your pride still keep you warm at night?" Eldar shakes his head. Ragnar steps closer, his voice low but sharp. "Then learn this. Obedience is not surrender. It is survival." He motions for another slave, a smaller, younger man to help. Together they lift the boulder, trembling. Ragnar nods. "Now both of you live another day." He turns to the rest. "You think obedience is weakness. But the wolf follows its leader, or it starves. The ship rows as one, or it sinks. Even the gods kneel to their own order." He looks to the horizon, where the sea breathes mist into the air. "And I am only the hand that keeps the world from breaking." That night, the hall glows red with firelight. Ragnar sits beside the hearth, sharpening his knife, the same blade he once used in battle. Eldar kneels nearby, staring at the floor. Ragnar gestures toward him. "Tell them what you learned," he says. Eldar's voice cracks. "That to live under Ragnar is to live with purpose." The hall murmurs. Some of the slaves avert their eyes, others nod, too afraid not to. Ragnar smiles faintly. A man who obeys learns faster than one who resists. The lash teaches the body but words, the soul. He sets the knife down and passes Eldar a cup of mead. "Drink," he says. "You have earned your breath for another sunrise." Outside, the wind wails through the mountains like something wounded. Inside, the fire crackles, and Ragnar's shadow dances across the walls like a restless god. The slaves sit silent, each one turning his lesson over in his heart. They have begun to understand. Ragnar does not rule through strength alone, but through the strange mercy of purpose. In the Longhouse of the North, obedience is no longer a choice. It is the only way to stay alive. The forge glows like a wound in the dark. Sparks leap into the smoke, hissing as they die. Ragnar stands bare-armed before the anvil, his face lit by the molten light. Around him, the slaves form a silent ring, summoned from their sleep to witness what he calls a test of loyalty. No one yet knows whose loyalty will be tested. A pot of iron simmers in the coals, its heat thick enough to make the skin prickle. The air stinks of burning tallow and fear. Ragnar takes up a rod and stirs the metal until it swirls like sunken fire. Then, without looking up, he says, "Every king leaves his mark upon his realm. Some do it with stones, others with words. I choose flesh." He turns to face them, eyes catching the firelight. "Who among you will bear my mark willingly?" No one moves. The silence stretches like a rope ready to snap. Finally, a young woman steps forward, thin, trembling, her hair shorn close from punishment weeks before. She kneels without a sound. Ragnar studies her, head tilted, as though weighing her against the night itself. "You understand what this means?" he asks. "I do, my lord," she whispers. He nods once. "Then you shall never be forgotten." He lifts the branding iron from the coals. It glows the colour of dawn. The slaves avert their eyes, some praying under their breath. Ragnar presses the iron against her shoulder. The hiss cuts through the hall like a scream from another world. She does not cry out. When it is done, Ragnar dips the iron back into the fire and hands her a cup of water. "Stand," he tells her. "You are no longer nameless. You belong to me and through me, to the gods." He turns to the others. Remember her face. She is proof that devotion can outlast pain. That night, while the others sleep, she lies awake near the hearth, the wound on her shoulder pulsing like a second heartbeat. Ragnar sits across the room, staring into the fire. He speaks softly, almost to himself. "The mark is not punishment, it is remembrance, so that when I am gone, the world will know who walked beside me." In the days that follow, she becomes both feared and pitied. The slaves bow lower when she passes, unsure whether she is one of them or something closer to their master. The mark gleams when she works, a red crescent shining beneath the soot. Ragnar watches her often, but says nothing. He does not need to. The lesson has already burned itself into every soul beneath his roof. Obedience is survival, but devotion makes you unforgettable. And in the Longhouse of Ragnar Lothbrok, being remembered is the only kind of freedom that lasts. The river was still frozen when they brought him in, a tall man, ragged, half-starved, but with eyes that refused to bow. He had been caught trying to flee in the night, his footprints leading all the way to the edge of the ice before the dogs found him. Ragnar stood by the gate as they dragged the man back through the snow, his breath forming white clouds that rose and vanished like ghosts. "Why run?" Ragnar asked, his voice calm, almost curious. "Have I not fed you, given you shelter from the storm?" The man spat blood into the snow. A cage with warmth is still a cage. The warriors laughed, but Ragnar did not. He stepped closer, studying the man as though he were a puzzle carved from bone. "Bravery in chains," he murmured. "That is a rare thing." He ordered them to tie the man to the post beside the longhouse and bring no food, no water. "We'll see how long courage lasts on an empty stomach." For 3 days the man stood in the cold, the frost claiming his fingers, his lips turning blue. The others watched from the shadows, whispering prayers that their own courage would remain unseen. Ragnar came each morning, offering him a bowl of broth. Each time, the man refused, smiling through cracked lips. On the third night, The wind howled across the fjord like a chorus of the dead. Ragnar came again, alone this time, carrying a fur cloak and a knife. He stood before the man and said, "If you had bent the knee, you would still live, but if you die now, your name dies with you." The slave lifted his head, and despite the frost on his beard, he smiled. "Then let my name freeze in your memory." Ragnar's expression changed, not anger, but something like respect. He stepped forward and drove the knife through the ropes, freeing him. The man fell to his knees, too weak to rise. Ragnar placed the cloak over his shoulders. "You chose your death," he said, "so let it come with honor." He turned to his warriors, who had gathered in silence. "Burn him as you would a soldier," he commanded. "He defied me, and for that I will remember him." At dawn, the pyre rose beside the river. The slaves stood in a circle as the fire caught, their faces lit by the reflection of the man who would not kneel. The smell of smoke and pine filled the air, and for a moment even the wind held its breath. Ragnar watched until the flames swallowed the last of the body. Then he said, quietly, "A man who fears death is already a slave, but one who smiles at it he is free, even in chains." That night, the slaves whispered his name as they worked, though none dared speak it aloud by daylight. Ragnar had burned his body, but his defiance had become part of the fire that now warmed them all. The first thaw of spring turned the ground outside the longhouse into black mud. The slaves worked barefoot in it, their feet sinking with every step, spreading manure for the barley fields that would feed the household through the next winter. Ragnar watched from the fence, arms folded, while the air filled with the smell of rot and thawing earth. "Every harvest begins in filth," he said to no one in particular. "Only fools think bread comes from clean hands." He signalled to a boy named Alric, barely 16, who had been captured the previous summer when his father's village fell to Ragnar's raid. The boy had refused to speak since, his silence mistaken for stupidity. Ragnar saw something else, pride buried under fear. He called him forward. "Do you know what keeps a man alive in this world?" Ragnar asked. The boy said nothing. Ragnar picked up a handful of mud, thick and red from blood spilled months before when they had slaughtered the cattle on this very ground. "This," he said, letting it drip through his fingers. "Blood feeds the grain, pain feeds the man. You cannot eat without it." He ordered Alric to kneel, pressed a wooden bowl into his hands, and nodded toward the field. "Fill it with earth," he said. The boy obeyed. When he returned, Ragnar drew a knife from his belt, sliced his own palm, and let the blood run into the bowl. "Now," he said, "mix it." The boy hesitated. Ragnar's eyes narrowed. "Do it." Alric stirred the mixture with shaking hands until the blood turned the mud to a dark, glistening red. Ragnar then walked to the fire pit, took a flat stone, and laid it before him. "From filth, something must be born," he said. He sprinkled the muddy blood onto the stone, spread it thin, and tossed in a handful of flour. The smell was strange, earthy, bitter, alive. When it hardened, he broke off a piece and handed it to the boy. "Eat." Alric looked sick but obeyed, chewing slowly. Ragnar watched him with the calm of a man testing a blade. "Now you understand," he said softly. "The food that keeps you alive is never clean. Not your bread, not your gods, not your soul." Later, as the slaves ate their real meal of barley and broth, Alric sat apart, staring at his hands. The blood had dried beneath his nails, and he couldn't wash it away. Ragnar passed behind him, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Good," he murmured. "You'll remember." That night, the boy dreamed of the field, how the frost had melted into mud, how the earth had swallowed the blood without question. He woke before dawn, went to the doorway, and looked out at the pale sky. Somewhere behind him, Ragnar's voice carried low through the hall. "Every man eats from the hand of death, only the wise learn to taste it." And so, the boy began to understand what it meant to live under Ragnar Lothbrok, to survive by taking life, and to find strength in the dirt itself. The wind that morning screamed through the fjord like a dying god. Snow whirled in tight circles outside the longhouse, biting at any skin foolish enough to meet it. Ragnar stood at the doorway, wrapped in furs, his breath clouding in front of him as his slaves gathered below the hill. He had ordered them there before dawn, their faces pale with cold and confusion. One of them, a man named Skald, had stolen from the stores, a smoked fish, no more than a mouthful. Hunger had driven him, but hunger was no excuse in Ragnar's hall. He believed winter was the truest judge of men. Those who bent to it were weak. Those who endured it deserved to live. They dragged Skald forward, his wrists bound with rope, his lips cracked from the cold. He fell to his knees before Ragnar, eyes wild with fear. "Mercy, Lord," he rasped. It was only one fish. Ragnar's expression did not change. One fish becomes one barrel becomes one winter lost. He motioned to his men, who brought forth a bucket of seawater, already half ice. Ragnar dipped his hand in, the chill biting deep into his flesh. "The sea forgives nothing," he said quietly, "so neither will I." He ordered Skada stripped to the waist, and when the man shivered and wept, Ragnar spoke again, not to him, but to the others. "You think pain is the worst fate? No. It is warmth that breaks you. Comfort rots the will faster than frost ever could." Then he poured the seawater over Skada's back. The man gasped, his skin turning blue beneath the freezing air. Ragnar did not look away. He poured another bucket, then another, until Skada's breath came in ragged gasps and ice began to crust along his shoulders. "The cold takes quickly," Ragnar said, kneeling beside him. "If your heart is weak, it will stop soon. If it is strong, it will learn." When Skard finally collapsed, Ragnar ordered him cut free. "Wrap him in furs and bring him to the fire," he said. The others hesitated, uncertain. Ragnar's gaze cut through them. Now. Hours later, Skada awoke by the hearth, trembling but alive. Ragnar sat beside him, carving a strip of dried meat. Without a word, he handed it over. The man stared, unsure whether to eat. "Take it," Ragnar said. "The gods have spared you, now earn it." In the days that followed, no one dared steal again, but more than fear lingered in the hall something colder. They had seen that Ragnar could destroy and restore in the same breath, that his mercy was as sharp as his cruelty. When the next storm came, the slaves did not curse the wind. They faced it with bowed heads and steady hearts, remembering the man who had frozen and lived. Ragnar watched them work through the snow and murmured to himself, "Pain keeps them breathing, fear keeps them mine." And the wind carried his words across the ice, whispering them like a prayer. Night fell early that winter, swallowing the fjord in silence. Inside Ragnar's hall, the fire roared, but no warmth reached the far walls where the slaves slept chained in rows. Among them was a woman from the east, her hair black as wet soil, her wrists scarred by iron. They called her Lifa, though none knew if that was her real name. She had been taken in a raid 2 summers ago, and had not spoken a word since until the night Ragnar made her sing. It began after a feast. The warriors were drunk, their laughter echoing off the timbers. Ragnar sat at the high seat, eyes heavy with thought, his fingers tapping against his cup. "The gods grow quiet," he said suddenly. "Let them hear us again." He turned his gaze to the slaves. "One of you will bring back their favour. A song, a prayer, something worthy of the ears above." No one moved. The fire crackled. Then, softly, Lifa began to hum. The sound was fragile, trembling like the flame itself. It wasn't a Viking song, no praise for Odin, no hymn for war. It was something older, softer, a tune from far beyond the sea. The hall stilled. Even the drunkest men fell silent as her voice rose higher, filling the smoky air with a melody that felt like memory itself. Ragnar watched her closely. When she finished, he rose and walked toward her, boots crunching over straw. "You sing in a tongue I do not know," he said. "What do the words mean?" Lifa looked up through her hair. It means the chains cannot reach the soul. A murmur ran through the hall. Ragnar's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in them, only interest. Is that defiance? No, she said. It is truth. He studied her a long while, then reached for the key on his belt. The iron clicked open, and the chains fell from her wrists. The other slaves stared, unable to understand. Ragnar gestured toward the fire. Stand, sing again. Lifa hesitated, then obeyed. She stood before the hearth, her bare feet on the cold earth, and began once more. Her voice rose like smoke into the rafters, weaving through the cracks, escaping into the night. Ragnar closed his eyes and listened. When the song ended, he said quietly, "Keep your freedom for tonight, but stay within the fire's light. The dark beyond is still mine." The next morning, she was found kneeling by the hearth, awake, unchained. She had not fled. Ragnar said nothing, only nodded when he saw her return to work with the others. From then on, the slaves worked in silence until dusk, and every night, Lifa's voice would rise again, softer than before, as if she sang not for herself, but for them all. And though the chains returned, they no longer sounded the same. Even iron, under her song, seemed to remember what freedom once felt like. The longhouse had gone quiet again. Only the fire spoke, spitting sparks into the darkness, its glow painting the walls in shades of red and gold. Ragnar sat before it, the weight of his axe resting across his knees. The slaves stood in a circle behind him, their shadows swaying like ghosts. At the centre of the floor knelt a man bound in ropes. Tosti, the blacksmith's helper, accused of dulling the edge of Ragnar's blade. Whether by accident or by fear, no one could say. The air stank of sweat and ash. Ragnar did not shout. He never needed to. His silence was worse than anger. "This hearth," he said finally, motioning toward the fire, "is where every man's worth is tested. It warms those who serve. It burns those who lie. Tonight, it will decide his fate." Two warriors brought forward a brand from the coals. The tip glowed white. Ragnar turned to Tosti. "You claim your hands are honest," he said. "Then prove it. Take the iron and hold it. If the gods know your truth, they will keep your flesh whole." A tremor ran through the crowd. The slaves looked at each other, horror in their eyes. But Tosti only nodded. His jaw clenched as the glowing metal was placed into his palms. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. He did not scream, not once. He held it until Ragnar raised his hand to stop him. The iron dropped, hissing as it struck the floor. Ragnar leaned forward, studying the wounds. The skin was ruined, charred black, but Tosti still breathed steady, his eyes steady. "Do you feel guilt?" Ragnar asked. "No," Tosti whispered. "Only pain." Ragnar stood, towering above him. "Then you have served your sentence, and the gods have answered." He ordered the ropes cut. "You will not work the forge again," he added. "But you will live and eat with your brothers tonight." The slaves stared, stunned. Mercy again, unpredictable and sharp-edged. Ragnar turned to them and spoke, his voice low, almost tender. "Fire reveals what chains cannot. It does not lie, it does not choose. When a man's flesh meets flame, his truth is laid bare. Remember that when you speak in my hall." That night, Tosti sat near the hearth, his hands wrapped in linen, the skin blistered and raw. Ragnar passed behind him once and paused. "You didn't scream," he said. "I thought it would please you if I didn't," Tosti replied. Ragnar gave a thin smile. "It did." Then he walked on. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the world in silence. Inside, the slaves sat closer to the fire, staring at the embers, wondering which of them might one day face the same trial. For in Ragnar's world, truth was never spoken. It was branded into the flesh, beneath the hearth that fed them all. The morning fog clung to the fjord like a shroud. The sound of gulls and the slow groan of oars echoed across the water. Ragnar's ships had returned from a raid, heavy with silver, salt, and silence. But the mood in the longhouse was not of triumph. A man had fled during the night. His name was Arn, a slave taken years before from Frankish lands. He had been quiet, obedient, invisible. That made his escape a wound to Ragnar's pride. No one defied him, not the sea, not the storm, not the chained. When dawn came, Ragnar sent men to the hills, their hounds sniffing for his scent through pine and snow. By midday, they found him. The dogs dragged him back through the village, blood streaking the snow where he stumbled. Ragnar waited outside, bareheaded in the cold, his cloak unmoving in the wind. When they threw the fugitive at his feet, Ragnar looked down without speaking. Arn's face was cut, his hands torn from running through thorn and ice. Ragnar's first words came like frost breaking. "Did you think the mountains could hide you from me?" Arn said nothing. His teeth chattered, his breath white in the air. Ragnar crouched beside him. "A man who runs from me runs from his fate." "But the gods," he said softly, "they never lose track." He rose and called for rope. 2 men brought it coarse hemp, stiff with old blood. Ragnar pointed to the great post outside the hall where horses were tied. "Bind him there, not with iron, with rope. Let him remember freedom's touch." They obeyed. Ragnar walked a slow circle around the kneeling man. "I will not kill you, death is release, but I will teach you what freedom costs." He drew his knife and cut a thin line across Arn's cheek, just enough to bleed. "This," Ragnar said, holding up his reddened blade, "is your mark. You ran with the blood of a slave, but you return with the blood of a coward. Now you will carry it for as long as you draw breath." Then, to everyone's astonishment, he cut the rope loose. "Go," he said. "You're free." Arn stared, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Ragnar smiled faintly. "Go on, the mountains are waiting." The man stumbled to his feet and ran again, vanishing into the trees. The slaves watched from the doorway, whispering prayers. Ragnar turned to them and said, "If he lives through the night, then he has earned his freedom. But if he dies, the crows will know his name." At sunrise, they found the body half buried in snow, his throat torn by wolves. Ragnar looked upon it without sorrow. "The world keeps its own order," he said. That night, he poured ale on the earth where the man had fallen. "May he run forever," Ragnar murmured. To those who served him, the message was clear. In Ragnar's realm, even freedom could kill. The morning after Arn's death, the longhouse was quieter than usual. The slaves moved like ghosts, speaking in whispers, their eyes fixed on the floor. They had seen cruelty before: whips, fire, hunger. But mercy from Ragnar Lothbrok was something different. It unsettled them more than pain ever could. Mercy, in his hands, was a blade sharpened on both sides. That day, a storm rolled down from the mountains, hammering the coast with sleet and wind. The boats were dragged onto the shore, the nets hung heavy with ice. Ragnar stood beneath the eaves, watching the slaves struggle to tie the ropes against the gale. One of them, a woman with hair the colour of straw, slipped on the frozen planks and fell hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. The sound of her cry carried through the wind. The others froze, unsure whether to help. To stop work was to invite punishment, but Ragnar was already striding toward her, his boots cutting deep into the snow. He crouched beside her, his voice calm, almost kind. "You cannot work with a broken leg," he said, "but you can still serve." He called for his men to carry her inside. The slaves watched in disbelief as she was laid by the hearth, wrapped in fur, given broth from Ragnar's own pot. The hall smelled of smoke and damp wool, but the warmth was real. Ragnar sat beside her and cleaned the blood from her foot himself. No one dared to speak. When she tried to thank him, he raised a hand. "Do not mistake mercy for love," he said. "The gods grant strength through suffering." I only make sure their lesson is heard." He stood and faced the others gathered near the door. "She will rest until she walks again. You will bring her food before you eat your own. Her pain feeds your debt. Her recovery will be your redemption." That night, the storm grew louder, and the woman moaned softly in her sleep. Ragnar remained by the fire, sharpening his knife, the rhythm steady as a heartbeat. His sons watched from the shadows. Ivar, still young but already fierce, asked, "Father, why not kill the weak?" Ragnar paused, his reflection flickering in the blade. "Because weakness is not always useless," he said. "Even a wounded hand can hold a sword, if taught how." He looked back at the fire, his eyes distant. "When the gods are merciful, it is never kindness, it is patience before judgment." By dawn, the storm had passed. The sea was calm again, and the slaves returned to work. The woman slept beside the dying embers, her breath shallow but steady. Ragnar stepped outside, the wind cold against his face. Behind him, his hall smelled of ash, blood, and faint mercy, the kind that healed only to remind the living who owned their next breath. And so his legend grew, not only for his wrath, but for his mercy, which cut just as deep. They found him at dawn, still upright, frozen where he stood beside the stables. His name was Grettir, a thrall taken from the north, a man of few words and fewer fears. He had been told to keep watch through the night, to guard the horses from wolves and thieves. When the sun rose, he had not moved. The frost had claimed him with his hands still gripping the spear, his eyes open, facing east toward the fjord. The others whispered that he must have angered the gods. Ragnar said nothing. He only stared at the body for a long time before ordering it brought into the longhouse. "He will not rot outside like carrion," he said. "A man who dies on his feet deserves fire, not worms." They placed the body near the hearth, the ice still clinging to Grettir's beard, his skin pale as bone. The slaves gathered close, uneasy. Ragnar crouched beside the dead man, studying him as though trying to read the last thoughts frozen into his eyes. "Why did you not kneel?" he murmured. "Even death could not make you bow." He turned to the others. This one served without complaint, without cowardice. He obeyed, but he did not beg. There is strength in that. The slaves shifted, unsure if his words were praise or warning. Ragnar gestured toward the fire. "We will give him to the flames tonight, but before that he will teach one last lesson." He ordered the body to be propped upright, bound to a post near the hearth, standing as it had been found. The sight was terrible, the frost melting down his face like tears. Ragnar spoke softly, his tone more sermon than command. "Look at him. The world fears death, but this one met it as he lived silent, steadfast. You think you are alive because your heart still beat. But tell me who here will stand when the cold comes for you?" No one answered. The only sound was the crackle of wood, the hiss of melting ice. Ragnar touched the dead man's shoulder and said, "He reminds us that obedience is not always fear. Sometimes it is faith." That night they built a pyre outside the hall. The wind was bitter, carrying snow and smoke in equal measure. Ragnar lit the fire himself, his face calm as the flames caught. The body burned quickly, sparks rising into the dark like scattered souls. When the pyre was nothing but embers, Ragnar spoke again. "He did not die for me. He died doing what was asked. That is enough." The slaves returned to their beds, haunted by what they had seen. Some swore they heard footsteps in the night, soft and heavy, as if Grettir still walked his post. Ragnar, sitting alone by the dying fire, whispered to himself, "The gods love the strong, but they remember the obedient." And in the silence that followed, even the wind seemed to bow. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the longhouse roof, slicing through the smoke like the blade of a god. Ragnar was already awake, standing by the fire with a brand in his hand. The metal glowed red, breathing heat into the cold morning air. Behind him, the slaves knelt in a line, their faces slick with sweat despite the frost. Today, Ragnar had decided, Loyalty would no longer be spoken, it would be branded into flesh. The hall smelled of iron and fear. He turned to his sons, who watched from the high seat. "A king cannot rule with swords alone," he said. "Steel breaks, blood forgets, but scars remember." He pointed to the first slave in line, a man who had once tried to hide food from the stores. "Step forward." The man obeyed, trembling, his eyes wide as Ragnar pressed the hot iron into the side of his neck. The hiss filled the room, louder than the man's scream. Ragnar didn't flinch. When it was done, he dipped the brand into water and said, "Now he belongs to me not by fear, but by fire." He motioned for the next one. A woman, this time young, her wrists bound with rope. She hesitated before stepping forward. Ragnar met her gaze. "Do you know why you are here?" She swallowed. "To be punished." Ragnar shook his head. "No, to be remembered." He lifted the brand again, but this time he did not press it against her. He lowered it just beside her face, close enough for her to feel the heat. "Loyalty," he said, "is not proven by pain, it is proven by choice." He turned the iron in his hand, letting the light catch it. "Kneel willingly, and you will walk without a mark." The woman dropped to her knees. Ragnar set the iron aside and placed his hand gently on her head. "Then your scar will live in your heart instead." A murmur spread through the hall. No one had ever seen mercy given during the branding. Ragnar looked to the others. "Do you understand now? Fear commands the body, but choice commands the soul. I want both." One by one, the rest were branded or spared, depending on what Ragnar saw in their eyes. Some bore their scars in silence, others with pride. And when it was done, the hall was filled with the smell of burned skin and the soft sound of weeping. Ragnar stood before them, his expression unreadable. "The mark you wear is not shame," he said. "It is a promise that you will never forget who gave you purpose." That night, as the fire crackled low, the branded slept uneasy, their wounds throbbing beneath the furs. But Ragnar slept soundly, the iron cooling beside him. He had bound their loyalty not with chains, but with memory, and memory, he knew, never healed. The longhouse was heavy with the scent of roasted meat and smoke. The warriors had returned from a raid, their laughter rolling like thunder through the rafters. Horns of ale clashed, songs rose, and for a time the air felt alive with triumph. Yet the slaves who served them moved like shadows, silent, careful, never daring to meet a warrior's eyes. Ragnar had ordered it so. Tonight was not a night for words, it was a night for silence. At the head of the table, Ragnar tore into a leg of boar, blood and grease glistening on his hands. He was quiet as he ate, listening to the rhythm of the hall, the laughter, the crackle of the fire, the low hum of the storm outside. When one of his men shouted for another song, Ragnar raised his hand, and the noise died instantly. "Enough," he said. "The gods hear too many words and too little truth. Tonight we will eat in silence, so they may listen instead." A chill passed through the hall. Even the torches seemed to dim. The warriors looked at one another, uncertain. Ragnar gestured for the slaves to continue serving. The scrape of bowls and the hiss of dripping fat were the only sounds that followed. Minutes stretched like hours. No one spoke. Ragnar watched the faces of his men, their unease, their fidgeting, their growing discomfort. Silence, he knew, was a sharper weapon than steel. It stripped away bravado, left only the man beneath the noise. A slave stumbled while pouring ale, the cup spilling across the table and soaking Ragnar's sleeve. Every heart froze. The man dropped to his knees, trembling. Ragnar looked down at him, his face calm, unreadable. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Do you fear me?" "Yes, my lord." "Good," Ragnar said, wiping his arm with a piece of cloth. "Fear keeps the hand steady, but fear without thought is useless." He nodded toward the fire. "Bring me the cup." The slave did as told, though his hands shook. Ragnar raised the half-empty horn, turned it slowly in the light, and said, Even the gods spill. What matters is how one cleans the mess. He poured the remaining ale into the fire. The flames leapt high, filling the hall with a hiss like breath drawn in anger. Then he looked around the table. Now you've seen it. The slave's mistake became an offering. Remember that when you boast of glory, it is not the blood you spill, but how it burns that pleases the gods. The silence deepened again, no longer fearful but reverent. The slaves continued their work, quieter still, and Ragnar's men sat with bowed heads, their laughter gone. When the feast ended, Ragnar rose and said only one thing before leaving the hall. The wise man feasts in silence, for noise feeds hunger, but silence feeds power. The fire burned long after he left, crackling like a voice that no one dared to answer. He arrived with the spring Thor, a stranger among the spoils of a Frankish raid, lean and quiet, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. The others called him Einar, though he never said if that was his name. He spoke little, worked without complaint, and learned faster than any slave Ragnar had ever owned. Within days, Ragnar had noticed him. Within weeks, he had chosen him. Einar began as a servant of the hall, fetching water, cleaning weapons, tending to the fires. But he watched Ragnar closely the way he spoke to warriors, the pauses between his words, the patience in his cruelty. Soon, Ragnar began calling for him directly. "The others obey," he said one evening, "but this one listens." It was not long before Einar was allowed to follow Ragnar beyond the hall to the fields, the ships, the sacred groves. He carried Ragnar's sword, polished his armour, fed his ravens. The slaves whispered that the gods must have marked him, for no thrall rose so high without paying in blood. One night, as the fog rolled in from the sea, Ragnar tested him. They stood alone by the shore, the tide lapping at their boots. Ragnar handed him a knife. "If you are truly mine," he said, "you will do as I command, even if it means ending your own life." Einar didn't flinch. "If I die," he said, "then I die serving you." Ragnar's eyes narrowed. "Then prove it." Einar turned the blade in his hand, not toward himself, but toward Ragnar's chest. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The air between them held the tension of steel. Then Ragnar smiled. It was not anger, but something colder. "Good," he said softly. "A true servant must know where power ends and where it can be taken." He took back the knife and clapped Einar on the shoulder. "You've learned faster than most kings." From that night on, Einar became more than a slave. He was a shadow. He slept outside Ragnar's door, ate what he ate, fought beside him when raiders came. He spoke when Ragnar was silent, and was silent when Ragnar thought. Some of the men began to fear him more than they feared their lord. Once, a warrior muttered that no slave should walk so close to a king. Ragnar overheard and said, "Then walk closer yourself, if you dare." No one did. But shadows, like loyalty, grow darker with time. Some nights, when Ragnar sat by the fire and Einar stood behind him, he could feel the man's eyes on his back, not in devotion, but in calculation. And Ragnar, who understood both love and treachery better than most men, never turned to look. "Let him watch," Ragnar said once, half smiling into the flames. "If he ever strikes, I'll die knowing I raised something strong enough to try." In the hall of Ragnar Lothbrok, even shadows had ambition, and that, more than chains or fire, was the true mark of his rule. Behind the longhouse, beyond the animal pens and the smithy, lay a hollow in the ground, a place the slaves called the drowning pit. It had filled long ago with rain and melted snow, black and still as a mirror. No one went near it unless ordered. Some said the pit had no bottom, that it reached down into hell itself. Others whispered it had once been a well, poisoned by a man Ragnar had cast inside. Whatever its truth, it belonged to him as surely as his sword or his hall. That spring, the pit was opened again. A young slave named Brynja had been accused of stealing wool to weave a hidden blanket for the sick child she cared for in secret. The theft had been small, the reason noble, but in Ragnar's world, intent was smoke, only action was iron. He called the household together, warriors and slaves alike, and led them to the hollow. The wind off the fjord was sharp enough to draw tears. Brynja stood shivering beside the pit, her arms bound, her hair tangled with straw. Ragnar faced her, his expression unreadable. "They say you took what was not yours," he said. "Is it true?" She lifted her chin. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ragnar nodded slowly, then drew his knife not to strike, but to cut her bonds. "And why admit it?" "Because the truth burns longer than a lie," she said. Something flickered in his eyes. He stepped closer. "Then let the truth decide if you live." He gestured toward the pit. "Step in." Brynja hesitated, then obeyed. The water lapped against her ankles, freezing even through her torn shoes. Ragnar turned to his men. "The gods will judge her as they have judged me. If she floats, she lives. If she sinks, she is theirs." He nodded once. 2 men waded in and pressed her under. The surface broke into wild ripples, then stilled. Moments stretched like eternity. No one spoke. Then her hand burst through the water, clawing toward air. Ragnar raised a hand, not to save her, but to watch. The hand fell away. Silence returned. At last he said, "She is gone." He turned to leave, but as he did, bubbles rose from the pit, slow, then frantic. Brynja erupted from the water, coughing, dragging herself to the edge. She lay gasping in the mud, alive. Ragnar stared down at her, rain dripping from his beard. "The gods have returned you," he said. "So now, you belong to them." He ordered a small hut built beside the pit and set her there to live, alone, tending its waters. Years later, men would whisper that the drowning woman guarded the pit still, speaking to those who came near in dreams. Ragnar never went back, but some nights he would wake to the sound of dripping water outside his door and smile, as if remembering that even death, under his rule, could be tamed for service. The summer sun hung low, casting long gold shafts through the open doors of Ragnar's hall. The air inside was heavy with the smell of mead, iron, and unspoken fear. The slaves moved carefully, each step rehearsed, each breath measured. None dared speak unless spoken to. For speech, they knew, was a weapon, and one of them had used it carelessly. The man's name was Odal. He had been heard mocking one of Ragnar's sons outside the stables, his words meant for laughter but caught by the wrong ears. By dusk, he was dragged before the hearth, his face pale beneath the grime. Ragnar sat upon the high seat, elbows resting on his knees, eyes sharp as a drawn blade. "They say words are wind," he said, his voice almost gentle. "But wind can bring a storm, can it not?" Odell fell to his knees. "It was foolishness, my lord, a jest. I meant no harm." Ragnar rose, the firelight crawling up his face. "A jest?" He paced slowly around the man. "You think a tongue is for jesting? No. The tongue builds, commands, destroys. Every word that leaves it has a price. You've spoken one too many without knowing its cost." He gestured for a bowl of water. It was brought, clear and still. "Look," he said, kneeling so Odell could see his own reflection. "That tongue has kept you alive your whole life, begging, lying, pleading. But a man who cannot control it has no right to keep it." The hall grew colder. Ragnar drew his knife, not the broad war blade, but a thin, curved one meant for carving. He set it beside the bowl. "You have a choice," he said softly. "Cut out the tongue that betrayed you, and you live. Keep it, and you die with your laughter." A whisper spread through the slaves like the flick of a whip. Odell's hands shook. "Please, Lord, mercy." Ragnar leaned close enough for Odell to see the faint scars on his jaw. "Mercy is the reward of silence. You lost that when you spoke." He turned away, giving the man a moment. The hall watched as Odell wept, his body trembling. Then, with a sound more pitiful than any scream, he lifted the knife. The water in the bowl rippled once, then went still. When it was done, Ragnar nodded for the wound to be bound. "He lives," he said. "Let him serve as reminder. The gods gave us one mouth and two ears for a reason. Listen twice before you speak once." From that day on, Odell worked in silence. The children of the hall called him the Whisperer, though he could make no sound at all. Ragnar often glanced at him when addressing the others, letting the image speak for him. In time, the hall grew quieter, the laughter faded, the chatter died, even the fire seemed to burn with restraint. And Ragnar, seated once more at the head of it all, smiled faintly. "Peace," he said, "is born from silence, and silence from fear." The raid had gone well, silver, slaves, and stories for the skalds. Yet Ragnar returned uneasy. He had seen omens on the sea, ravens circling the mast, thunder with no clouds, the kind of signs that made a man feel watched. When he reached his hall, he ordered the warriors to rest, but summoned the slaves to the hearth. Something, he said, had to be renewed. They gathered as he ground herbs into the fire, filling the air with bitter smoke. The flames burned blue, licking upward like the tongues of unseen spirits. Ragnar stood before them with a bowl of ash in one hand and his knife in the other. "Every king rules by oaths," he said, his voice low, steady. "Oaths to gods, oaths to men, but those mean nothing if those beneath him have not sworn the same." He stepped forward, eyes sharp beneath his fur-lined hood. "Tonight you will swear to serve, to obey, to hold your tongues, even in thought. Speak false, and this ash will choke you in your sleep." One by one, they were made to kneel. Ragnar dipped his fingers in the ash, smearing it across each forehead. The mark left a grey line that stung the skin. "Repeat," he commanded. "I serve Ragnar, as the earth serves the Sunday." They obeyed, their voices trembling. Smoke coiled through the air, settling into their hair and clothes until the whole hall smelled of burnt blood and dust. Then Ragnar called for his sons. "You too," he said. "An oath means nothing if it runs only one way." The boys looked uncertain, but he motioned to the hearth. "Kneel." "Kneel." Bjorn was the first. "Father," he said, "I already serve you." "Words mean nothing without the gods as witness," Ragnar replied. "Say it again, with your knees in the ash." Bjorn obeyed, and his brothers followed. Ragnar touched each of their brows, his fingers leaving black smudges that made them look like warriors painted for battle. "Now you are bound as one," he said. "Slaves and sons alike, all who live beneath this roof share one breath, one oath." When it was done, he turned back to the fire, his shadow stretching long against the wall. "This house is not built from wood or stone," he said softly. "It stands on obedience. Break that, and it falls." The slaves bowed low. Some wept, others pressed their foreheads to the floor. Ragnar poured the rest of the ash into the flames, which roared high, devouring it whole. Later, when the hall slept, the smell of smoke lingered in every corner. The slaves dreamed of grey hands pressing over their mouths, of ash filling their lungs. And Ragnar, awake by the dying fire, traced a black streak along his own cheek. "Oaths," he murmured, watching the embers fade, "are only strong when sealed with fear." The wind outside rose, scattering the ashes through the cracks of the longhouse, carrying his promise into the dark. The morning broke cold and clear after days of rain. The mist still clung to the fjord, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the wooden beams of the longhouse. Ragnar sat on the steps outside, his leg bound in wool and soaked with herbs. A wound from the last raid had festered, and though he refused to limp, everyone could see the pain behind his calm. He hated weakness, even in himself, but that morning weakness had found him. He called for a slave named Ketil, a strong, quiet man from the Baltic, once a fisherman. now little more than muscle in chains. Ketil knelt before him, eyes fixed on the ground. "You have carried my shields, my nets, my burdens," Ragnar said. "Now you will carry me." The order struck the crowd like a blow. No one carried Ragnar Lothbrok, not even his sons. But Ketil rose without hesitation, stooping to let the king climb onto his back. Ragnar settled there, his weight solid, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder. They began the climb up the steep hill that rose behind the village, the one that overlooked the sea. The path was slick with mud, the wind sharp with salt. Ragnar said nothing. Ketil's breath came hard and heavy, his feet sliding with every step. Twice he stumbled, but Ragnar did not curse him. He only murmured, "Stand," again. When they reached the top, Ragnar slid down and stood beside him, leaning on a staff. The view stretched wide the village below, smoke curling from roofs, ships moored like dark bones in the water. "This," Ragnar said, "is what men die for. Land, labour, loyalty. Yet all of it rests on the backs of those who will never own it." Ketil said nothing, his chest heaving. Ragnar turned to him. "Tell me, slave, what does it feel like to carry a king?" Ketil hesitated. Then, with a voice low and raw, he said, "Like carrying any other man, only heavier." For a moment, Ragnar laughed, a sound rare and strange, like a crack in the ice. Then he struck Ketil across the face, not in rage, but in ritual. "Good," he said. "You speak truth. Never forget it." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small bronze arm ring. "Take it," he said. "You have carried me farther than most who call themselves free." Ketil stared, unsure whether to accept. Ragnar forced the ring into his palm. "Wear it when you die," he said, "so the gods know you bore the weight of a king." They descended together in silence. By the time they reached the longhouse, Ragnar's limp was gone. The wound still burned, but something colder and older filled him instead, respect. That night, Ketil was given a seat by the fire. He did not speak, but the others looked at him differently, and Ragnar, staring into the flames, whispered just loud enough for the gods to hear. "No man is free, but some carry freedom on their shoulders." It was a night without stars, the kind of blackness that swallowed even the sound of the sea. The torches outside the longhouse burned low, their flames wavering in the wind. Ragnar stood before them, a circle of warriors and slaves gathered around. In his hands he held a collar of iron, heavy, cruel, newly forged. It gleamed like wet blood in the firelight. "This," he said, lifting it high, "was found buried beneath the ashes of an old hall in the east. They called it a mark of shame. I call it a reminder." The slaves shifted uneasily. None knew what he meant, though all could feel the weight of the moment. Behind Ragnar, the forge still hissed, glowing orange in the dark. He gestured toward the flames. "Every man wears a collar," he said softly, "some around their throats, some around their hearts. He turned his gaze on a man named Halfdan, the youngest of the slaves, captured only months before. His crime was defiance. He had refused to bow during the last feast, claiming his gods bowed to none. Ragnar admired the courage but could not let it pass. "Step forward," he said. Halfdan did. His jaw was tight, his eyes steady. Ragnar smiled faintly. "You remind me of myself when I still thought defiance was freedom." He placed the collar over the forge until it glowed red, then lifted it with tongs, the metal humming in the air. The hall held its breath. Ragnar walked slowly toward the boy. "You will not kneel?" "No." "Then you will stand," Ragnar said, and snapped the collar shut around his neck. The hiss of searing flesh echoed through the hall, followed by the sharp scent of burning skin. Halfdan did not scream. He clenched his teeth, his breath hissing between them like steam. Ragnar stepped back, watching the glow fade to dull iron. "Now," he said, "you carry your pride with you, forever." He turned to the others. This collar is not punishment, it is truth. The world burns every man differently, some from within, some from without, but all bear the mark. He poured a ladle of water over the boy's head, the steam rising like a ghost. You live because you did not beg, he said quietly, and because even I respect a fire that does not die easy. He faced the crowd once more. Remember this night. When the flames come for you, let them make you stronger, or let them consume you. The gods care not which. The hall was silent as Ragnar returned the tongs to the forge. The iron collar gleamed faintly in the firelight. A dull ring of defiance turned to obedience. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt and smoke down to the sea. Inside, Halfdan stood motionless, the faint wisp of steam rising from his throat like an offering. And Ragnar, staring into the forge, whispered to himself, "Even rebellion, when shaped by fire, can serve." The nights were long again, and the cold crept through the cracks of the longhouse like a living thing. The slaves slept close to the hearth for warmth, their breath misting in the dim light. Among them was Astrid, a bondwoman from the Saxon coast, known for her quiet hands and downcast eyes. She worked without error, spoke only when ordered, and yet Ragnar watched her more than most. Something about her silence did not feel like fear. It felt like waiting. One morning, when the others had gone to fetch water, Ragnar entered the weaving room and found her there alone. She was kneeling by the loom, her hands busy, her face calm. But what caught his eye was what she hid beneath the wool, a thin scrap of parchment, folded and bound with string. Ragnar stepped forward, silent as shadow. "What is that?" Astrid froze. "It is nothing, my lord," she whispered. "Nothing is a dangerous thing to hide," Ragnar said, taking the paper from her trembling hands. He unfolded it carefully. The marks upon it were letters Latin, written in a hand too fine for a slave. A prayer, perhaps. Or a memory. He turned it over in his palm. "You can write," he said. It was not a question. Her voice barely rose above the crackle of the fire. "I was once a monk's daughter, before the raids." The words hung heavy in the air. Ragnar looked at her not as a slave, but as something rarer. "And you kept this secret all this time." "I feared it would make me useful," she said softly. "And the useful die quickly." Ragnar smiled faintly. "Wise." He folded the parchment again and set it in the fire. The edges curled, blackened, turned to ash. Astrid's eyes shone with loss, but she did not move to stop him. When it was gone, Ragnar said, "Knowledge that hides is like gold buried in a grave it feeds no one. From now on, you will teach my sons the letters of your priestly tongue." Her breath caught. "You would trust me with them?" "I trust no one," Ragnar said, "but the gods love irony. Let them laugh while you teach my blood the words of your dead faith." In the days that followed, Astrid sat with the boys near the hearth, tracing letters in the ashes with a stick. Ragnar often watched from afar, saying nothing. The other slaves whispered that the king had taken a witch into his house, one who could make words live after death. One night, Astrid left a single mark scratched into the beam beside her bed, a symbol no one else could read. When Ragnar saw it, he touched it once and nodded. He did not order it erased, for he knew that every secret carried its own power, and some chains were stronger when forged from silence and ink. And though her parchment was gone, her knowledge burned brighter, like a hidden fire waiting to be fed. The rain came hard that week, hammering the roofs, turning the yard to mud and the fjord to steel. The men were restless, trapped indoors with their hunger for the sea. The slaves worked twice as hard, fetching water, mending nets, keeping the fires alive. Ragnar moved among them like a spirit of the storm, quiet, patient, dangerous. He had not spoken much since the snows melted, and the silence around him felt heavy with thought. On the third night, a fight broke out. One of his warriors, a broad man named Hroald, had cornered a young slave near the grain barrels. No one saw how it began. only that the girl's screams reached the longhouse before the deed was done. When the warriors dragged the man inside, Ragnar sat by the fire sharpening his knife. He did not look up when they threw Hroeld to his knees. "Whose property did you take?" Ragnar asked quietly. Hroeld spat blood into the dirt. "She's only a thrall. I took nothing worth naming." Ragnar stopped sharpening. The hall went still. "A thrall?" he said slowly. "Then she belongs to me." He rose, the firelight catching the edge of his blade. "And you would take what is mine?" The warrior opened his mouth, but no sound came. Ragnar's knife flashed once, quick and precise. He did not kill him. He cut deep across the man's cheek, just below the eye. The wound bled fast, staining the floor. "Let that scar remind you," Ragnar said. "Flesh is law. The slave's body, the warrior's body, the king's body, all belong to the same order. To take without right is to break it." He turned to the trembling girl crouched by the door. "Stand." She obeyed, clutching the torn hem of her tunic. Ragnar pointed to Hroeld. "You see his blood? It spills for you, not because you are free, but because you are under my word. That is what keeps this world from devouring itself." He sheathed the knife, his voice calm again. "Take her to the women's house. Feed her. The gods have seen enough for one night." The hall remained silent long after he left. Hrold's blood soaked into the floor, the smell of iron thick in the air. None dared speak. They all understood that what Ragnar had done was not mercy, it was maintenance. A world without law would fall apart faster than a rotten hull, and Ragnar ruled not with kindness, but with balance. Later, as thunder rolled over the fjord, Ragnar stood outside beneath the rain, letting it wash the blood from his hands. His son Bjorn joined him, staring at the dark sky. "Why spare her?" the boy asked. Ragnar's eyes did not leave the horizon. "Because every man must know that I can protect what is mine, even from those who serve me." The rain fell harder, drumming against his face. "This is the law of flesh, my son," he murmured. "It binds all things, life, death, and every breath between." The sea was calm that morning, flat as a blade, the air heavy with the scent of salt and rot. The ships lay moored in the shallows, rocking gently against the tide. Ragnar walked among them with slow steps, his eyes distant, his fingers tracing the wood, as though feeling the heartbeat of the hull. Behind him, a man limped Egil, one of the older slaves, who had once been a fisherman before capture. The man's hand had festered from a cut gone wrong. The flesh was swollen and red, leaking pus. Ragnar had noticed the stench during the last feast. Now, he stopped beside the water, gesturing for the man to come closer. "Let me see it," Ragnar said. Egil obeyed, holding out the trembling hand. The wound was ugly, black around the edges. Ragnar studied it with quiet curiosity. "The sea heals," he said, "but only when it is allowed to bite." He called for a bucket of seawater. When it arrived, he plunged the man's hand into it. Egil screamed, the salt burned like fire. Ragnar did not move, did not blink. "Pain," he said, "is the truest medicine. It teaches faster than comfort." The man tried to pull away, but Ragnar's grip was iron. "Hold," he commanded. "Do not fight the cure." The other slaves watched in silence as the minutes dragged on, the man's cries swallowed by the wind. When Ragnar finally released him, the skin was raw and bleeding, but clean. Ragnar dipped his hand into the same water, smearing salt on his own palm, then pressed it against Egil's wound. "There," he said softly. "Now the sea has taken part of you. When it heals, you will belong to it and to me." Egil fell to his knees, clutching his hand, gasping. Ragnar turned to the others. "Remember this," he said. "The world is full of rot disease, weakness, fear, but it can all be washed away if you are brave enough to endure the sting." He looked out over the fjord, where the tide lapped quietly against the stones. Salt preserves what time would destroy, so too must pain preserve the soul. That evening, Egil's fever broke. He slept by the hearth, his hand bandaged in linen, soaked with seawater. Ragnar watched him from across the hall, drinking from his horn. One of his sons approached Ubi, curious as always. "Why heal him at all?" he asked. "He is old." He slows the others. Ragnar smiled faintly. "Because the sea does not choose whom it cleanses. It takes the strong and the weak alike. What matters is who rises after." He stared into the fire, his eyes reflecting its red light. "Every man in this hall has a salt wound," he said. "Some on their skin, some in their hearts. I only decide which ones are worth saving." Outside, the tide receded, pulling the blood-stained water back into the depths, carrying with it the pain, the lesson, and the quiet proof that even suffering could serve a purpose in Ragnar's world. The moon hung low that night, red as rust over the fjord. Inside the longhouse, the air was thick with smoke and tension. A debt had been called. Ragnar's warships needed new sails, and the flax stores were nearly gone. His warriors grumbled, his farmers starved, and his slaves, those were the coin he still had to spend. He called them into the hall one by one, his voice quiet but firm. "You eat my bread, you sleep beneath my roof. Tonight you will repay me, not with silver, but with blood." A murmur rippled through the room. None dared speak, though they all understood. Ragnar stood beside a wooden bowl, carved with runes, its inside dark and cracked from old offerings. He drew his knife and turned to the first man, a slave from Ireland, young and pale, shaking in the firelight. "Do you believe in the gods of this land?" Ragnar asked. The man stammered, I do not know them, my lord." Ragnar smiled faintly. "Then meet them." He took the man's hand and cut the palm, letting blood fall into the bowl. "You have now paid them in the only coin they accept." He moved down the line, cutting each slave's hand in turn just enough to sting, to mark. When the bowl was half full, he raised it toward the rafters. "The gods drink deep," he said, "and through their thirst we are bound." He motioned for a slave girl to bring water from the spring. When she did, Ragnar poured it into the bowl, swirling the mix until the blood thinned into a dark red haze. Then, without hesitation, he drank. Gasps filled the hall. Ragnar wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Now we share the same blood," he said. "You are no longer slaves, you are part of my oath. Your strength flows in me, and mine in you. Betray me now, and you betray your own veins." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to bow. Ragnar passed the bowl among them, commanding each to drink. They obeyed, some with shaking hands, others with desperate devotion. The taste was metallic, sharp, eternal. When it was done, Ragnar set the bowl by the fire and let it burn. "This is how loyalty is forged," he said. "Not through fear, not through gold, but through what makes us all the same: flesh, pain, and blood." Later that night, he sat alone, staring into the dying flames. A single drop of blood had dried on his thumb. He turned it over in the light, thinking of the line that now tied him to those beneath him, an invisible chain made of trust, terror, and need. His sons would call it madness. His enemies would call it witchcraft. But Ragnar knew better. He had given his slaves something they did not expect, a reason to bleed for him. And in that, he had made them his forever. It happened in the grey hour before dawn, when even the ravens were still. A scream tore through the longhouse, sharp and short, then silence. By the time Ragnar reached the sleeping quarters, the torches had already flared to life. There, on the straw, lay one of his lesser warriors, Eric the Tall, his throat cut, his blood soaking the rushes black. Standing beside the body, trembling but unbroken, was the killer, a slave named Leif. The man's hands were slick with red, his eyes wild with the disbelief of what he had done. When Ragnar entered, the others stepped aside, leaving a circle of cold air between them. Ragnar looked down at the corpse, then at the slave, and said only, "Why?" Leif swallowed hard. "He came in the night," he said. "He would have killed me, or worse." The hall buzzed with whispers. No slave had ever spoken of worse in Ragnar's presence, not aloud. Ragnar raised his hand, and the noise died. "You took a life that was not yours to take," he said. "Yet you claim it was to save your own." "Yes, my lord." Ragnar studied him for a long moment, the firelight glinting in his eyes. "Then you have killed twice," he said. "Once in body, and once in the order of things. Both demand balance." He ordered the corpse carried outside and placed upon a pyre. "He was a fool," Ragnar said to the gathered men. "A drunkard, a brute, and now a lesson. Let his death not be wasted." Then he turned to Leif. "And you will not die today, you will bury him." The slaves gasped. Leif's face went pale. "Bury him, my lord? He is to burn." Ragnar nodded slowly. "He will burn, yes, but you will carry the ashes to the cliffs, barefoot, without food, and when you return, you will tell me what the sea whispered to you." They watched as Leif did as ordered. The fire consumed Eric's body by dusk, and when only embers remained, Ragnar gave the slave a small sack of grey dust. "Go," he said. "Let the gods decide if you are murderer or messenger." Leif vanished into the night, barefoot on the frozen path. Some said he never made it to the cliffs, that the gods claimed him halfway. Others whispered that Ragnar saw him again weeks later, standing by the water with salt in his hair and madness in his eyes. When Ragnar was asked what became of him, he only said, "He learned what all men must blood buy's freedom, but the price is never paid in full." That night, Ragnar poured ale onto the floor where Eric had fallen and muttered, "The strong die by their arrogance, the weak live by their defiance. Both serve the same gods." And though the hall returned to its uneasy peace, no one ever again slept easily with a blade within reach, for in Ragnar's world, even slaves could make death their final act of obedience. The first frost came early that year. The fjord froze so quickly that ships were trapped in the harbour, caught like flies in amber. The snow buried the fields, the game fled into the woods, and hunger crept into every breath. Ragnar's hall grew quiet. Even his warriors spoke little, their bellies half empty, their tempers sharp as blades. The slaves bore the weight of it, hauling firewood, breaking ice, carrying water that froze before it reached the door. Ragnar watched them from his high seat, his expression unreadable. "The cold," he said, "was the gods' way of reminding men who ruled them. Chains," he murmured one night, "are not forged by iron alone. Winter makes its own." By mid-season, one of the slaves, a boy no older than 12, collapsed while carrying a bucket of snowmelt. His body hit the floor like a dropped stone. The others froze in terror, unsure whether to help or stay still. Ragnar rose slowly, the hall creaking beneath his steps. He knelt beside the boy, pressed a hand to his neck, and found it still warm. "Alive," he said. "Barely." He ordered the fire stoked higher. The boy was stripped and wrapped in furs. The other slaves expected punishment for letting him falter, but Ragnar only stared at the flames. "You all think these chains are your burden," he said, "but you are wrong. They are your shelter. Without them, the cold would take you faster." He pointed toward the iron collars that glinted in the firelight. "Those rings keep you near the fire. They make you obey. They keep you alive. That is their mercy." The slaves said nothing, but the words stayed in their minds. The next day, Ragnar had them gather in the yard. He stood before them, bare-chested despite the cold, frost in his beard, his breath white as smoke. "Each winter," he said, "I test my hall. Not my warriors, they are easy. I test you, because if the slaves can survive the dark, the gods will bless the free." He took a length of chain from the forge, still hot from the coals, and plunged it into the snow. Steam rose, hissing. "The gods temper men the same way," he said, "through heat and cold, through pain and silence." He handed the chain to the nearest slave. "Pass it around," he commanded. "Feel it. That is the world burning one side, freezing the other. You survive only by standing between both." When the chain returned to him, he tossed it aside and said, "If you live until spring, you will have earned your breath again. If not, the snow will bury what the fire does not need." That winter claimed 3 of them, but the rest endured. When spring finally broke, Ragnar stood outside and looked at the thawing fields. The slaves followed, thin and quiet, but alive. Ragnar nodded to himself. "Chains," he said softly, "are not the proof of weakness. They are the reason the weak survive." The snow had begun to melt, but the cold still lingered in the bones of every man in Ragnar's hall. The roof dripped with thaw, each drop echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. The fields outside were a swamp of black mud, and tempers like the ground were slow to dry. It was then that one of the slaves, a man named Torfi, refused an order. He was not bold nor foolish. He was simply tired. When told to carry firewood for the forge, he said, "The gods can burn their own trees." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The hall went still. Ragnar turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "What did you say?" he asked. Torfi's eyes flickered with fear, but his jaw held firm. "My back is broken, Lord. My hands are raw. I have nothing left to give." Ragnar rose from his seat. "Then you have everything left to learn," he motioned to his men. "Bring the whip." The slaves recoiled, and even the warriors shifted uneasily. Ragnar's punishments were never done in haste, nor in anger. They were done with purpose. Torfi was dragged to the centre of the hall, stripped to the waist, and bound to a post. Ragnar walked around him slowly. The whip coiled in his hand like a serpent. "Do you know why I punish disobedience?" he asked. Torfi spat blood into the straw. "Because it reminds you that you are a god." Ragnar stopped. The faintest smile crossed his face. "No," he said, "because it reminds you that you are still alive." The whip cracked once, sharp and clean. The sound tore through the hall. Torfi grunted, but did not cry out. Ragnar struck again, harder. The second blow drew blood. Still, the man did not scream. By the 5th lash, his knees trembled, his body slick with sweat and crimson. Ragnar paused, breathing evenly, and said, "You think silence makes you strong, but strength is not stillness, it is endurance." He raised the whip again. This time, he stopped mid-swing. The hall waited. Ragnar let the whip fall from his hand. "Enough," he said. "He has learned." He turned to his sons. "Remember this. The whip is not for pain, it is for memory. The body forgets comfort, but never the sound of leather on flesh." Ragnar ordered Torfi untied and handed him a cup of mead. "Drink," he said. "You'll need it." The slave took it with shaking hands. "Why spare me?" he whispered. Ragnar looked into the fire. "Because the gods love defiance. They just hate when it forgets its place." That night, the hall stayed silent, long after the flames died. Torfi lay near the hearth, his back a map of scars, his spirit strangely unbroken. And Ragnar, watching from the shadows, murmured, "A slave who endures pain becomes harder than the whip that struck him, and such men build kingdoms." Outside, the thawing earth swallowed the last of the snow, and the longhouse exhaled as if relieved to have survived its own trial. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the mountains like the roar of 1,000 drums. Lightning split the sky above the fjord, and the longhouse shuddered under the wind. Ragnar's people huddled close to the hearth, whispering prayers, afraid to name the gods aloud. Only one man did not kneel. His name was Brander, a slave who had once been a priest of the old ways before his capture. He was tall and thin, his hair streaked with grey, his eyes always searching the smoke for shapes unseen. The others said he had lost his mind in the raids, that he spoke to shadows when no one was near. But Ragnar had kept him alive. "Madmen," he said once. Hear truths that sane men fear. When thunder struck the ridge above the hall, Brand rose suddenly from the floor, his voice echoing over the wind. Odin walks tonight, he said. He calls for blood. Ragnar's sons made to silence him, but Ragnar lifted his hand. Let him speak, he said. The hall grew still, except for the groaning of the timbers. Brander turned toward the door, his eyes wide and unblinking. The Allfather's ravens circle your roof, Ragnar Lothbrok. They whisper of the debt you owe. Ragnar stood slowly, the firelight cutting across his face. And what debt is that? The debt of kings, Brander said. Every crown must pay in flesh what it takes in power. You have fed your gods the blood of others, now they hunger for yours. The hall erupted into murmurs. Ragnar stepped closer, the air between them thick with smoke and storm. And how do you know this? Brander's lips twisted into a smile. Because they speak to me. I have carried their words since before your name was known. You make sacrifices to be seen. I make them to be heard. Ragnar studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the door. If you speak to gods, then ask them to spare my hall. Brander nodded once, walked into the storm, and vanished into the rain. Hours passed, the thunder faded, the dawn broke pale and quiet. When the slaves opened the door, they found him on the hill, kneeling in the mud, his head tilted toward the sky. His body was cold, his face peaceful. In his hand, he held a raven feather, black, unburned, dry, despite the rain. Ragnar took the feather and laid it on the hearth. The gods heard him, he said. And they answered. That night, he ordered no feasting, no laughter. The hall burned incense instead of meat, and the slaves whispered that Odin had truly passed among them. Ragnar sat by the dying fire, the feather between his fingers, and said to no one, Some chains are made of iron, others are made of voices. Then, almost gently, he added, And sometimes, even a slave can remind the gods who they are. The sky hung low that morning, swollen with rain, the light dim and colourless. The longhouse smelled of damp wood and fear. The slaves worked in silence, scrubbing the floors where blood had dried from the night before. It was not from battle, but from punishment one that none dared speak of. Only Ragnar knew why it had been done. Only he ever truly knew. When the chores were finished, he called them to the yard. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs. A single wooden post stood in the centre, dark with old stains. Ragnar stood beside it, bareheaded despite the chill, his axe resting against his shoulder. Last night, he said, his voice low, someone stole from the mead stores. A small thing, a cup, perhaps. But theft, like rot, grows unseen until the wood breaks beneath your feet. He let the silence stretch. The wind tugged at his cloak. I do not care for punishment, he said finally. I care for lessons. So today we will learn together. He gestured for his son Hvitzerk to bring a lamb from the pen. The boy obeyed, leading the bleating animal into the circle. Ragnar knelt, stroking its wool with surprising gentleness. This creature has done nothing wrong, he said. It lives as the gods made it hungry, fearful, innocent, but it will die to teach you all the weight of small sins. He drew his knife and cut cleanly across its throat. The sound was quick, almost soft, but the blood came fast, steaming in the cold. Some of the slaves looked away. Ragnar did not. He caught the blood in a shallow bowl, his movements calm, almost reverent. When it was done, he stood and turned to them. The gods take life to remind us that ours is borrowed. Every breath you draw, every bite you eat, belongs first to them. When you steal from the gods themselves. He dipped his fingers into the warm blood and flicked it across the faces of the nearest slaves. This, he said, is not cruelty, it is remembrance. One of the women began to weep quietly. Ragnar faced her. Do you think I enjoy this? He asked. No, but the world demands its balance. To forget that is to invite chaos, and chaos spares no one, not kings, not slaves. He poured the remaining blood onto the frozen earth. The ground drinks, the gods are satisfied. Then he wiped his hands on the wool of his cloak and said, almost softly, "If you must steal, do it from death itself. That is the only thief the gods respect." That night, the slaves washed their faces in cold water until no trace of red remained, but the smell of iron clung to them still. Inside the hall, Ragnar sat alone by the fire, staring at his hands. "The lamb dies," he murmured, "so the wolf remembers his place." And outside, beneath the darkening sky, the earth soaked in silence and obedience. It happened at dusk, when the light turned copper and the air smelled of rain. The slaves were hauling timber from the forest, their chains clinking in rhythm, their breaths white against the fading Sunday. Among them was a man named Sten, a thrall of great strength and quiet rage. His iron collar had been fastened around his neck for 3 winters so long that the metal had grown dull and fused with rust. That evening, as they dragged the last log toward the longhouse, the collar gave way. It snapped with a sharp crack, falling into the mud like a serpent shedding its skin. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound rang louder than thunder. Ragnar stepped from the shadows of the yard, his eyes fixed on the fallen iron. "The gods choose strange moments for mercy," he said softly. "Or perhaps they test me." Sten dropped to his knees. "It was not my doing, Lord. The metal broke." "I know," Ragnar replied. "But freedom is never an accident." He picked up the collar and turned it in his hand, the broken ends jagged, wet with rust. "You've worn this longer than some men wear their honor," he said. "And now it lies dead in the dirt. Tell me, what will you do without it?" Sten hesitated, the weight of the question pressing heavier than the chain ever had. "I will serve," he said finally. Ragnar studied him. "Not because you must, because you choose?" "Yes, Lord." Ragnar smiled faintly, though his eyes remained cold. "Then prove it." He tossed the broken collar into the fire pit. "Fetch it when the flames die. If you can hold it in your bare hands without flinching, I'll know your loyalty burns hotter than fear." The hall fell silent. The slaves gathered around as Sten knelt beside the fire. The collar glowed red, then white. The smell of burning wood filled the air. Ragnar waited, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When the last flames faded to embers, Sten reached into the pit. The iron hissed as his skin met it. His teeth clenched, but he did not pull away. He lifted the collar with both hands, the heat searing his palms. When he dropped it into the water bucket, steam rose in a burst, and he fell back, gasping. Ragnar stepped forward, looking down at him. "Now you understand," he said. "Freedom is not when the collar breaks, it's when you can bear the pain it leaves behind." He turned to the others. "Let this be the last time you fear the sound of breaking iron. The gods do not chain men, men chain themselves." That night, as the hall slept, Sten sat by the doorway, his hands blistered but steady. The broken collar lay beside him, blackened and cool. He did not wear it again, but he did not throw it away either. For in Ragnar's world, even freedom came with the memory of fire and the scent of smoke that never truly faded. The wind carried the smell of salt and death long before the ships appeared. Ragnar's warriors had gone to meet a Saxon force inland, and when they returned, they brought victory and bodies. The dead were laid in rows outside the hall, wrapped in cloaks, their blood mixing with mud and rain. Among the survivors was a slave woman named Runa, whose husband had fallen in the fighting. She had begged to follow the warriors to tend the wounded. Now she stood among the corpses, her face streaked with ash. Ragnar came to her at dusk, his cloak heavy with rain. "You fought?" he asked. "I carried water," she said, "and I buried the ones who could not drink." He studied her, a wife's duty, even after death. Runa met his gaze without flinching. A wife's love does not end when the man does. Ragnar's eyes darkened with thought. Then, prove it, he said. He gestured to the pyre being built near the shore. You will lie beside him when he burns. The gods love devotion made in flame. The slaves gasped. Some cried out in protest, but Runa did not. She bowed her head. If that is what the gods demand, then I will go. That night, as the fire rose, the warriors drank and sang to their victory. Runa was brought forth, dressed in white wool, her hair unbound, her husband's sword placed across her chest. Ragnar stood before her, his face cold as the sea. You would follow him to Valhalla? He asked. I would follow him anywhere, she said. He nodded. Then follow him here. She stepped toward the fire, the heat blistering her skin. The crowd murmured, some in awe, others in horror. But before she could step into the flames, Ragnar raised his hand. Stop! The hall fell silent. He turned to his men. Do you see her? She does not run, she does not weep. That is faith. He faced Runa again. The gods have seen your courage. That is enough. He took her hand and led her away from the fire. Your husband's spirit will walk with pride. You, however, will serve in my hall. You will remind every man here what devotion looks like when tested by death. Runa knelt before him, trembling. You would spare me? I do not spare, Ragnar said. I choose. The fire roared behind them, sending sparks into the night. The smell of burning flesh and pine filled the air. Ragnar watched the pyre for a long time, his face unreadable. When it was done, he turned to the crowd. Let no man here claim he knows loyalty better than this woman, he said. The battlefield takes husbands, the flame takes wives, but the gods, he looked skyward, the gods take only the brave. And, as the ashes drifted out to sea, Runa remained by the fire, eyes closed, the heat kissing her face. In her silence, she had become something greater than slave or widow. She had become part of Ragnar's legend, a bride not of a man, but of the flame itself. The harvest had failed that year. The rains came too late, the barley rotted in the ground, and the fish had fled the fjord. Hunger walked through Ragnar's hall like an invisible guest, sitting beside every man, breathing down every neck. Even the warriors had grown gaunt, their laughter brittle and forced. The slaves suffered most. They were bones wrapped in rags, eyes hollow, hands trembling from labour without food. One night, when the moon was thin and cold, Ragnar called a feast, the hall filled with smoke and suspicion. The slaves served platters of what little meat remained thin cuts of goat, boiled roots, broth watered to nothing. Yet Ragnar sat at the high seat as if dining among kings, his expression calm, his voice steady. Tonight, he said, we honour the ones who feed us, though they may not eat. The slaves glanced at one another, unsure if it was mockery or mercy. Ragnar motioned to his sons. Bring the chains. The words froze the air. The warriors obeyed, carrying iron shackles blackened with soot. Ragnar stood, raising a piece of bread in his hand. Every feast begins with gratitude, he said, and gratitude begins with remembrance. We forget too easily who brings the wood, who stirs the fire, who bleeds in the fields. So tonight we remember them as they are bound to us, as we are bound to the gods. He gestured for the slaves to sit among the warriors. The men murmured in protest, but Ragnar silenced them with a look. Sit, he commanded. Eat, drink. You have earned this. The slaves obeyed, trembling as they took their places. Then Ragnar's men fastened the chains around their wrists, linking each slave to a warrior. There, Ragnar said softly. Now we are one household, one hunger, one fate. Let us eat. The hall was filled with the sound of metal clinking against wood, of bowls shared between hands both free and bound. Ragnar watched them eat, how the warriors hesitated, how the slaves took small, fearful bites. When the last scraps were gone, Ragnar lifted his horn. "What you feel now," he said, "is the truth of life. The chain does not humiliate, it connects. The free man thinks he owns his strength, but he eats only because the slave works. The slave thinks he has nothing, yet his labor fills the king's plate. Both are shackled, and both are fed." He drained his cup and tossed it into the fire. "If you wish to break the chain," he said, "you must first understand it." At dawn, when the feast ended, Ragnar ordered the chains removed. The slaves stumbled to their beds, unsure whether they had been honored or punished. Ragnar remained by the fire, turning a length of broken chain in his hands. "The gods eat too," he murmured. "They feast on men's pride, and bind us with it." Outside, the frost returned, and the sea groaned beneath its own hunger. But in Ragnar's hall, no one ever forgot the night when freedom and bondage ate from the same bowl. The mist hung low over the fjord that morning, swallowing the shore and blurring the world into grey. Ragnar stood outside his hall, a wolfskin over his shoulders, watching the fog move like smoke from an unseen fire. Behind him, the slaves worked silently, dragging logs, mending nets, feeding the livestock. All except one, a thin man with pale eyes, who knelt by the water's edge, whispering to his reflection. His name was Arvid, or so he had said. Slaves rarely kept their names, and few dared to speak them. But this one had not forgotten. When Ragnar first heard him call himself by name, he had not punished him. He had simply watched. That morning, Ragnar walked down to where the man knelt. The mud sucked at his boots, and the water rippled as he approached. "What do you call yourself?" Ragnar asked. The man didn't look up. "Arvid, son of Einar," he said softly. Ragnar crouched beside him. "You remember your father." "I remember his hands," Arvid said, "how they built the house you burned." The words should have earned him the lash, but Ragnar only smiled faintly. Then, "I built you new walls to live under. Call that balance." He stood, looking out over the water. "Tell me, Arvid, what good is a name to a slave?" Arvid rose slowly, meeting his master's eyes for the first time. "It reminds me I was once more than this, that I can be again." The boldness of the answer drew murmurs from the other slaves nearby. Ragnar tilted his head, studying him. "And if I take that name from you?" "Then I will find another," Arvid said. Ragnar's smile deepened. "You speak like a free man." "I speak like one who remembers freedom," Arvid replied. Ragnar nodded, then turned to the others. "Hear him," he said. "This one dares to name himself. While you kneel, he stands. While you forget, he remembers. Tell me who is freer, the man with chains or the one who no longer knows they're there?" No one answered. Ragnar's tone hardened. "A name is not given, it is carried. The gods knew that when they carved runes into the world. You think they feared men who could fight? No, they feared those who could remember." He looked back at Arvid. "Keep your name then, but understand it now belongs to me too. Every time you speak it, it honors me as much as it defies me." Arvid bowed his head. "Then we are both remembered." That night, Ragnar sat alone by the fire, tracing his own name in the ash, each letter slow and deliberate, the mark of a man who knew how easily memory could vanish. Outside, the fog began to lift. By dawn, the fjord was clear again, and on its surface, two names drifted together in the reflection, one belonging to a king, the other to a slave. Both bound, both unforgotten. The snows melted late that year, and with them came disorder. A new slave struck another over a piece of bread, a warrior killed a thrall in anger, and whispers began to fill Ragnar's hall. Whispers of unfairness, of fear, of the gods turning their eyes away. Ragnar heard them all and said nothing. But one night, when the moon rose like a polished shield, he summoned every soul beneath his roof, warrior, wife, and slave, to stand before the fire. He placed his axe across his knees and spoke quietly, the way thunder sometimes murmurs before it breaks. "Men think strength rules a hall," he said. They are wrong. It is law that keeps fire from devouring wood. The crowd waited. Ragnar gestured to a young man lying bound at his feet, a warrior who had struck a slave dead in anger. He thought his rank gave him freedom. He forgot that freedom without law is only another chain. He rose, lifting the axe by the haft. So tonight, the law will be spoken not from scrolls, but from breath. He began to pace. In this house every man has his worth, and every life its weight. A thrall's blood spilled without cause will be repaid by the killer's pain. A slave who defies command will answer not to rage, but to order, and if I fail to keep balance, the gods will make law of me. He stopped before the bound warrior, and asked the slaves, "What is justice?" No one spoke. Then, one voice, a woman's, rose from the shadows. Justice is when fear changes sides. Ragnar turned toward her. It was Runa, the widow he had once saved from the pyre. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. So be it. He gave the axe to one of his sons, and took instead a branding iron from the coals. "This mark," he said, "is not punishment, it is memory. Let it remind all that the law of this house is older than pride." He pressed the iron against the warrior's forearm. The hiss filled the hall, followed by the smell of burning flesh. The man gritted his teeth, but did not cry out. Ragnar handed the iron to a slave. "Now you," he said. "Hold it, so you remember that justice does not belong to the strong, it belongs to those who survive it." The slave's hands shook, but he took it. The iron glowed faintly, reflecting in Ragnar's eyes like lightning in a storm. "This hall stands because we keep its balance," Ragnar said. "The day it tilts toward cruelty or mercy alone, it will fall." When it was done, he threw the iron back into the fire. The hall exhaled as one. "From this night forward," Ragnar declared, "no man's blood will fall without law. My word is the hearth, and all who live by its light are bound by it." The slaves bowed their heads. The warriors did the same. And for the first time in memory, the hall of Ragnar Lothbrok was silent, not from fear, but from understanding. The rain fell steady, soft as breath, washing the blood from the stones outside the hall. A slave had died in the night, a quiet man named Herulf, who had served as cook and woodcutter for 3 winters. He had not been strong, nor clever, nor defiant. He had simply worked until his heart gave out by the hearth fire, his head bowed as though in prayer. Most slaves were buried without word or rite, but Ragnar ordered otherwise. At dawn, he commanded that a pyre be built at the edge of the fjord. "Every man who served under this roof," he said, "will meet the gods by flame, not mud." The slaves gathered with wary awe, carrying logs and kindling, stacking them beneath the grey sky. None spoke. They did not understand why Ragnar, who punished them as swiftly as he rewarded, would honour one who had died without glory. Ragnar himself worked beside them, his hands black with soot, his breath visible in the cold. When the pyre was ready, they laid Herulf upon it, wrapped in a tattered wool cloak. Ragnar placed a wooden bowl beside the body, half filled with grain. "He cooked for others," he said, "but went hungry himself. Let him eat on his journey." The slaves bowed their heads. Ragnar's warriors looked on, uneasy, unused to seeing their king speak for a thrall. Ragnar drew his knife and cut his own palm, letting his blood drip onto the wood. "No man serves me alone," he said. "We all serve something greater, the flame that devours, and the ash that remembers." He nodded to one of his sons to bring the torch. The boy hesitated. "Father," he asked quietly, "why burn him as a warrior?" Ragnar took the torch himself, because the gods care nothing for rank. They see only deeds, and this one's life was built on silence and toil. That is a kind of courage too. He lit the pyre. The flames caught quickly, hissing in the rain, turning smoke into a dark banner that rose over the fjord. The slaves watched, some crying softly, others clutching the hems of their tunics as though afraid the gods might take them next. Ragnar stood unmoving as the fire climbed higher. "We live by breath, but we are remembered by labour," he said. "When my warriors fall, they are sung of. When my slaves die, the world forgets. I will not have forgetting in my hall." When the fire burned low, Ragnar took a handful of ash and scattered it into the wind. "Go where even kings cannot follow," he murmured. "The chains end there." The hall that night smelled of smoke and quiet reverence. The slaves worked slower, softer. Their eyes lowered not in fear, but in strange peace. Ragnar sat alone by the embers, his hand still bleeding. "The living obey because they must," he whispered. "But the dead obey no one, and that is why the gods love them." Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the last trace of Herolf into the sea. The winds shifted the next morning, carrying the scent of salt and burning pine through the valley. The sea was restless, the gulls loud, the sky the colour of steel. In the longhouse, that unease found its echo. A new slave, a dark-haired man from the east, had struck a warrior, not hard, but hard enough to draw blood. The act rippled through the hall like lightning. No thrall had dared touch a free man since Ragnar's rule began. They dragged him before Ragnar at once. The man's wrists were raw, his lips split, but his eyes still burned. Ragnar sat on the high seat, his hand wrapped around the hilt of his knife, watching. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked quietly. The man spat blood into the dirt. "I defended myself." Ragnar tilted his head, studying him the way a wolf studies a wounded deer. "Defended," he repeated, "a fine word, but you forget where you stand. In my hall, even defence is defiance." The man's voice trembled but did not break. "If a man strikes me, I will strike back, even in chains." The hall went silent. Ragnar rose, his shadow stretched long across the floor. "And what is your name, that speaks so boldly?" The man straightened. "My name is gone. You took it with my freedom." Ragnar smiled faintly. "Then I will give you another. For today you will be called Kelda, the current that runs against the tide." He stepped closer. "But every current meets the shore eventually." He ordered the man taken outside. The wind howled through the yard, scattering ash from the night's fire. Ragnar pointed to the shoreline, where the tide rolled in heavy and black. "You will walk into that water until it covers your head," he said. "If the gods wish to keep you, they will. If not, you will wash clean of your defiance." The slaves gasped, but none dared plead. The man nodded once. "Then the gods will know my heart." He walked toward the sea barefoot, the cold biting his skin. The warriors followed, silent witnesses. When the waves reached his chest, he turned once to face them all. "A man can be bound," he said, "but he cannot be owned." Then he stepped forward and disappeared beneath the water. They waited. The waves crashed and retreated, moments stretched. Then the sea gave him back his body, tossed onto the stones, lifeless but free of its chains. Ragnar looked down, his expression unreadable. "He spoke truth," he said softly. "And for truth, he paid the right price." He turned to his sons. "Remember this. The whip breaks the back, but defiance breaks the soul. Both are needed to rule." That night, Ragnar ordered no song, no laughter. The hall was quiet, except for the whisper of the tide outside. Some said he mourned the man, others said he envied him. When morning came, Ragnar went to the shore alone and left his knife in the sand. "Let the sea keep it," he murmured. "It knows better than I, the cost of resistance." The morning was sharp and windless, the kind of cold that made sound travel like metal striking stone. Ragnar's hall stood silent, smoke rising from the roof in thin, grey ribbons. A crime had been committed, a theft from the armory, a missing blade. By dusk, the thief was found, a slave named Halli, caught trying to trade the sword for food in the village. The punishment was clear, but this time, Ragnar decided, he would not be the one to deliver it. He called for Ketil the slave, who had once carried him up the mountain when his leg had failed, the man who had earned Ragnar's respect and a bronze arm ring. Ketil stepped forward from the shadows, his face pale, his expression uncertain. "Do you trust me?" Ragnar asked. "Yes, my lord," Ketil said. "Good," Ragnar replied. "Then today you will do what I cannot." He motioned to the centre of the hall, where Halli knelt with his hands bound. This man broke the law. He stole from his master. But the gods do not always need kings to swing the axe. Sometimes they need those who know the weight of it better. Ketil froze. "You want me to kill him?" Ragnar's gaze was steady. "You were a slave once. You know hunger. You know fear. So you will choose mercy or death. But whatever you choose, you will answer to the gods for it." The hall fell into stillness. Ketil looked at Halli, then at the blade Ragnar placed in his hand, a simple axe, old and worn. The firelight danced across the edge. "I cannot," Ketil whispered. Ragnar stepped closer. "You must. To refuse is to defy the balance. The law must be served, even by those who once lived beneath it." Ketil's eyes filled with tears. He raised the axe slowly, his hands trembling. Halli's breath came fast, but he did not plead. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a single motion, Ketil brought the blade down. The sound was dull and final. Ragnar did not smile. He only said, "Now you know, mercy and judgment are not opposites, they are brothers." He took the axe from Ketil's shaking hands and set it by the door. "Every king needs a man who has seen both sides of the chain," he said. "Today you became that man." Ketil sank to his knees, whispering prayers no one could hear. Ragnar placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have given him what he sought," he said quietly. "Freedom of a different kind." Later, as the others slept, Ragnar found Ketil sitting outside, staring at the frozen earth. "I feel nothing," Ketil said. Ragnar nodded. "That is the god's gift. Feel nothing today, and you will rule yourself tomorrow." In the morning, the blood was gone from the floor, but the echo of the axe still lingered in the wood. The slaves worked in silence, each glance carrying the same thought, that mercy, under Ragnar Lothbrok, was never far from the blade. The longhouse smelled of pine oil and wet wool. Outside, the snow had melted into deep mud, and the air was heavy with thaw and rot. Inside, Ragnar's wife, Aslaug, sat by the window weaving fine linen. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet storms. Few dared to cross her, except for the slave girl who served her meals and kept her secrets. Her name was Inga, a pale-haired girl from across the sea, taken in a raid when she was barely grown. She moved through the hall with the silence of smoke, speaking only when needed. To most, she was invisible. To Aslaug, she was indispensable, and to Ragnar, she was dangerous. He had seen the way Aslaug looked at her, not as a mistress looks at a servant, but as a woman might look at a reflection she could not quite destroy. Inga obeyed, yes, but with the stillness of someone who chose to, not someone who must. Ragnar saw that. He saw everything. One evening, as a storm gathered above the fjord, Ragnar entered the weaving room. Aslaug did not rise. Inga knelt nearby, spinning wool, her hands steady despite the thunder outside. Ragnar stopped behind her, the smell of sea and rain clinging to his cloak. "Do you fear the storm?" he asked. Inga shook her head. "The storm does not know my name." Ragnar smiled faintly. "Then you are luckier than most." Aslaug looked up from her loom. "She has no need for your riddles, husband," she said coldly. "She works hard, as you wished." Ragnar stepped closer. "Hard work is good," he said, "but a silent slave is like an unsharpened blade. It dulls from disuse." He crouched before Inga, studying her face. "Tell me," he said softly, "do you dream of freedom?" Aslag's loom stopped mid-turn. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Inga's eyes flicked toward her mistress, then back to Ragnar. "Dreams," she said, "are for those who sleep easy." Ragnar chuckled. "Then you will live long in my hall." He rose and turned to Aslag. "You see, she knows her place better than most of your warriors." When he was gone, the room filled again with the sound of the loom. Aslag's hands moved fast, almost violent. "You spoke too boldly," she whispered. "I only answered," Inga said. "Answer less," Aslag warned. "Men like him do not forgive words that taste of truth." That night, as the storm howled outside, Ragnar lay awake beside Aslag. "Your servant is clever," he murmured. "She is loyal," Aslag replied. "Loyalty," Ragnar said, "is a dangerous virtue. It binds tighter than chains." In the morning, Inga was gone from the weaving room. No one saw her leave. No one heard her steps. Some said Aslag sent her away. Others swore Ragnar freed her in secret, impressed by her calm defiance. But every night after, Aslag wove the same pattern white thread and one black strand always in silence, as though remembering the ghost of a girl who had once dared to speak without trembling. The summer mist clung thick to the ground, the kind that swallowed footsteps and muffled sound. Ragnar rode at the head of his men, his cloak dragging through the dew, his thoughts heavy as the sky above. A slave had fled again. This one, a craftsman named Orm, had forged nails for Ragnar's ships, tools for his warriors, and chains for his own kind. He had been clever, quiet, useful, and gone. For 3 days they hunted him through the marshlands, following prints that bled water instead of blood. On the 4th morning they found him. The bog stretched endless and black, a mirror to the clouds. Orm lay half submerged, his hands pressed into the mire, his breath coming in slow, terrified gasps. He had tried to hide in the mud, but the earth had swallowed him halfway, greedy and patient. Ragnar dismounted, the water lapping at his boots. "You ran far," he said, "but not far enough." Orm looked up, his face streaked with mud and tears. "I only wanted to live," he said hoarsely. "I built your ships, I built your swords, but I cannot build my own freedom." Ragnar crouched beside him. "Freedom is not built," he said softly. "It is taken, and the world always takes it back." He drew his knife and pressed it into the wet earth beside the man's cheek. "Do you know what the bog is, Orm?" The slave shook his head. "It is the earth's mouth," Ragnar said. "It eats men who forget their place. Warriors, kings, slaves, it makes no difference. It preserves what it devours, so the gods can look upon their mistakes for eternity." Orm began to weep. "Kill me then. Don't leave me for the mud." Ragnar shook his head. "No. The mud is the truest grave. It keeps your body whole, as if waiting for you to rise again. That is punishment enough." He motioned to his men. They drove stakes around the edge of the bog, tying ropes to Orm's wrists and ankles not to tear him apart, but to hold him still. Ragnar's voice was calm. "The bog will take you slowly. You will sink as the gods watch, and your body will remain when even your name is gone, a monument to defiance." As the ropes tightened, the mud crept higher, swallowing Orm's chest, his neck, his mouth. His last sound was not a scream, but a breath wet and hollow, as though the earth itself sighed in satisfaction. When he was gone, Ragnar stood in silence, the mist coiling around him like smoke. "The gods remember those the ground keeps," he said, "and so will I." They left him there, the stakes standing like grave markers above the still water. That night, back in the hall, Ragnar set a bowl of bog water by the fire. "For Orm," he murmured, "may he sleep deeper than kings." No one touched it, but every time the fire hissed, the slaves swore they smelled the marsh wet, cold, and eternal. The autumn winds had begun to bite again, rattling the longhouse walls like the restless fingers of ghosts. Ragnar sat alone by the dying fire, his sons away on raids, his hall quieter than it had ever been. Only one slave remained in his service, an old man named Sigmar, who had been there longer than any could remember. He had seen Ragnar's rise, his victories, his cruelties, and his slow retreat into legend. Sigmar no longer feared him. Perhaps that was why Ragnar kept him. The old man moved through the hall with the steady grace of one who knew every creak in the boards. He brought Ragnar his mead, stoked the coals, and mended his cloak without being asked. Ragnar watched him one night as the wind howled through the smoke hole. "You should have died years ago," he said. Sigmar smiled faintly. "So should you, my lord." Ragnar chuckled a rare, dry sound. A brave tongue for a slave. "I am the last lord," Sigmar said. "There is no one left to whip me." Ragnar leaned forward, studying him. "You have served longer than most kings rule. Tell me why never run?" Sigmar looked into the fire. "I did run, once, but I found nothing beyond your shadow. It stretches too far." The words settled like ash. Ragnar poured a cup of mead and handed it to him. "Drink," he said. "A king should not drink alone." Sigmar hesitated. "That would break your law." Ragnar smiled faintly. "There are no laws left here, only memory." They drank in silence. Outside, the wolves sang to the moon, and the sound stirred something old in Ragnar's chest. "Do you know what haunts a king at the end?" he asked. "Not his enemies, not his wounds. It is the faces of those who served him, those who obeyed so well he forgot they were men." Sigmar's eyes softened. "Then remember me as a man tonight, my lord." Ragnar nodded. "I will." He reached into the fire, pulled out a coal, and held it in his palm until it smoked. "All my life I have ruled with flame," he said quietly. "It burns what it touches, but it also keeps the dark away." He dropped the coal into a bowl of water. The hiss filled the silence. When the dawn came, Sigmar found him still seated by the ashes, his head bowed, his breath gone. The fire had died with him. The slaves' quarters were empty. There was no one left to bury a king, so Sigmar did it himself. He carried Ragnar's body to the cliff above the fjord, wrapped it in the cloak he had mended 100 times, and laid it beneath a cairn of stones. Before leaving, he whispered, "You freed more men through fear than mercy, but you kept them all alive." He turned back to the hall one last time, the smoke rising thin into the grey sky. By the next winter, the roof had fallen, the hearth gone cold, and the name of Ragnar Lothbrok drifted into myth remembered by no kings, only by the last slave who ever called him lord.